All right, I think we're good to get started. So welcome everyone. We're really excited to have you here for today's webinar talking about the process of high school admission. So we're backing up 4 years from what we normally focus on to help you better understand the application process for private and boarding high schools in the US, including tips on how to apply, what the process looks like, as well as a deep dive into the ISEE and SSAT tests, which are very commonly used in the high school admission process, and how you can best study and prepare for those tests in order to do well on them. So I am going to very quickly introduce our panelists. Today we have Jamie and Alex. Jamie is one of our academic advisors and tutors who does a lot of work, particularly with our ISEE and SSAT students. And Alex is one of our amazing college advisors who also happens to have a full-time job as a director of admissions at an independent high school in the US. So she is perfectly positioned to talk about this process and what it can mean both for your high school experience and eventually for your college experience as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Alex and Jamie to take you through the rest of the webinar.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and good evening or afternoon or morning, wherever part of the world you're in. I'm super excited to be here with you all and honored to talk a little bit about the application process and the admissions process for independent high schools in the US. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of schools and where you can learn about them. We'll talk about the application process. And then I'm going to kick it over to Jamie, who's our resident expert on the ISEE and the SSAT, to talk a little bit about what to expect in that testing process and some tips and tricks. So we will jump right in. Anything to add, Jamie, before I kick off the spiel?
No, that was great. Thank you.
All right, we'll do it. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is the different types of independent schools. So, and first of all, I know a lot of folks might refer to these as private schools. In the US, you'll also hear them referred to as independent schools, which just means they may be independently affiliated. There are groups of schools that are religiously affiliated, so Catholic schools. And so that is just the name difference in that. But there are a couple different types of core schools and core program offerings that, particularly for families who may live abroad, might be considering in the boarding category too. But we'll start with the day schools. Day schools are exactly that. They have a day population of students. They don't have a boarding option. All of their students live locally or commute to school in the morning and go home in the afternoon. Some day schools do offer a homeschool, or I'm sorry, a homestay option. So if you're an international student or a student not living in the area, they may offer opportunities to live with another family at the school and help arrange that, or work with an agency who can help arrange that. So day schools are not off the table to consider if you're coming from far away and don't live in an area, but you'll want to do your research on if that day school offers any sort of homestay programming. Then there are day boarding schools. Day boarding schools mean that most of the student population is day students, but there is some portion of the population that are boarding. So for instance, at the school that I work at, about 10 to 20% of our students are boarding with us, and 80 to 90% of our students are day students. And so it just depends on what you're looking for, right? What's great about that is a small, intimate boarding community. You're usually looking at anywhere from 50 or smaller in most of these cases. So you really get to know who you're living with and who you're staying with, and have all eyes on your student. And it's great because it gives them access to having local friends who can go do trips with them on the weekends or check things out locally if they're living in a city. So really, it's a really great option for students to consider. And the day boarding schools are located all over the country, right? Same for all of these cases, but you can sometimes find unique ones in different locations, depending on where you're interested in. Boarding day schools is the more common boarding type school. And for students who are looking from outside of the country, this is usually where most of their attention is drawn, though again, I'll highlight day boarding as an option as well. But boarding day schools means that most, usually somewhere above 50% of the population is boarding. Some of the students can come from local as well. So you would be living with both international and domestic students. It just depends on the program. And then finally, there's 5-day boarding options as well. And some of the other schools in the day boarding or boarding day category may offer some form of 5-day boarding. And essentially what that means is that you may live far away enough that it's more convenient to drop your kid off on Sunday night and pick them up again on Friday evening, or they might send your kid home on Friday evening via the train if you're a 2-hour train ride or something like that. This can also be great if you have family in the area of a day boarding school or a boarding school where you say want to have them go live with their aunt and uncle on the weekend, and then during the weekday they actually are at the school and staying on campus. So tons of options and different options depending on what your level of comfort is or what your interest is for your students' experience. I know that there are so many schools out there in the country, and so there's always this question of where do I even learn? Where can I start to learn about some of these schools? Google, of course, is a quick search on, boarding schools in Seattle, boarding schools in the New York area can give you a quick turn to just check out some school websites and really start to get a feel for what are you interested in and what's important to you in this experience. Some other tools that can help you discover schools are review websites such as Boarding School Review or Niche, where they do have families who actually give reviews of different schools. And so you can get a little sense of what campus life is like or what families' experiences have been at those schools through these boarding review sites. Finally, the Logic Prep team, you can always reach out to us and we're happy to always work with you on how we can best suggest schools or how someone from our team might be able to support you in this process. So just know we're a resource as you're thinking about this process and happy to help. So I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit more about the application process and thinking about what's necessary and what are the steps and application materials that are really a part of this process. For starters, the primary application is going to be demographic information. Where are you from? Parents' emails, all of that information. Every school will have some version of this. Some schools do use a common website. So Ravenna, School Admin, or the standard application online are just a couple of the examples. And what's great about those tools is similar to the Common App when you apply to college, you actually can use that to apply to multiple schools at once. So the standard application online, for instance, sends your application. You just have to check the box to which schools you want it to go to, and it'll send it out to those schools. That can also be a really helpful tool to help you explore schools that may have either open seats, depending on your time of year you're applying, or specific programs that you may be looking forward to. The primary, like I said, primary application, pretty much just demographic information, who you are and where you come from. Some schools and most schools will require a short written sample or a graded writing sample. And so that could look like if you attend school where English is the primary language of instruction, they may ask you to submit a graded English essay from one of your classes. This helps them for students who are international or English as a second language families or students to really assess your writing in a graded context, right? And really getting a look at some authentic writing samples. A short written sample may be asked, if they don't require a graded writing sample, they may ask for either a live writing sample during a student interview, or they may want from the SSAT or the ISEE, they may see your written sample, just depending on the test too. Finally, the parent statement, which is usually incorporated into that primary application, but I do like to call attention to it for families to expect. There will always be a few questions that schools want you as parents to answer about your student, especially when they're thinking about, is your student going to be living on campus with us? They really want your opinion and your feedback about your kid and your experience. Of course, you're going to hopefully have nothing but positive things to say, but I encourage you to be also authentic about what are some of the challenges your student has that they may anticipate. I think schools are looking for a balance of really getting to know your kid, and they want all of the positives, but they really want to know also, where is your kid going to be challenged? or need some extra support so that they can ensure that they have the absolute best setup for your student to succeed when they arrive. So now those are the primary basics of most application pieces. The requirements that vary by school include teacher evaluation. So every school is different. Some schools may ask for up to 2 letters of recommendation. Some schools may require none, particularly because not all of your teachers may speak English, right? Or that might not be a language that they're fluent and ready to write a recommendation in. You can always submit additional letter recommendations to school via email if they don't require them, but pay attention to what they do require because you want to make sure that you're meeting the expectations for the school. Some schools may say they want a math recommendation or an English teacher recommendation, and so really try to make sure that you're giving every school what it is that they specifically require. If for whatever reason you find that you may have a challenge with teacher evaluations, either your teacher's English is not their primary language, or they're just not available or willing to write letters of recommendation, reach out to the admissions offices for these schools and just have a conversation about what other alternatives might be acceptable. Maybe it's a coach or a tutor who you've worked with, and the school may be willing to accept that in lieu of a teacher recommendation if that's not possible. The student interview. Most schools at this point are doing a student interview as a part of their process. The student interview serves 2 main purposes. For starters, it really serves to get, actually 3. It serves to get you familiar with the school. That's your opportunity as a student or family to ask questions about the school that you may have, about the transition process, about what it's like for students on campus, what they expect from students. It is also the school's opportunity to really get to know your student. And that is a time for your student to really talk about their interests, their passions, what they might pursue at that school. Most of the student interviews are really honing in on what is your student passionate about and interested in. And then the last piece, especially for students who English is a second language, the student interview also serves as a language evaluation tool. It really helps them assess a student's ability to be fluent in conversation. And not to say that a student has to be perfect, particularly because we know that a student may grow between now and when they start at a new school. So it is not the end all be all, it is just a part of that proficiency, but it does give a little peek at what it may be like for your student to have a flowing conversation at school. That flows nicely with the ELL proficiency tests. Some folks may already be familiar with the Duolingo, the TOEFL Junior, but in a lot of circumstances, many of these day boarding schools may require some English proficiency tests. Most will give you the option of which test you'd like to submit, so you can submit your strongest score, but they will often anticipate or ask for these tests just to make sure that your student either can be successful in the program, or some schools do offer English language support. And so it may be whether that's the right fit program for your student, right? Whether they're recommending that they join the ELL program or they join the traditional all English program. And then finally, the SSAT and the ISEE scores. These tests can be submitted to most of your independent schools that you're applying to. Some schools require them, some schools are optional, and some schools do not accept them, just like college. But I would say on the high school front, most schools are still asking for these at this time. And for international students who are looking, I always recommend that you consider taking the test and practicing just so you have the score to really support your application. And so I will hand it over to Jamie to talk a little bit more about the tests in particular and what to expect. So Jamie.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. All right. So essentially the SSAT and ISEE are both sort of equal tests in terms of the testing landscape and the admissions landscape. I would equate them to the difference between the ACT and the SAT. There are still schools that prefer one over the other. for instance, Brunswick takes the SSAT, but not the ISEE. So it's always worth reaching out to the schools that you're most interested in to find out what their policies are before you're really getting too far into thinking about these tests. But when you do start thinking about them, you first will want to figure out which test you're taking. And so part of that is what grade you're applying to. The ISEE is made by the ERB testing service, and they actually make a separate test that is also for elementary school applications. So if you're in that range where you're applying for second, third, fourth grade, it's definitely a situation where you want to contact the school directly and find out whether they prefer the ISEE or the ERBs. Most schools at that grade level will give the tests themselves. So definitely something to get out in front of if you're going to go through the application process for a younger student. The SSAT doesn't start until 4th and 5th grade. The ISE, like we said, goes down to applicants for 2nd and 3rd grade. I would say that more people probably look at these tests in applying for high schools, but they function the same way in all of these levels. You see here in parentheses the actual scaled scores. So the ISEE goes from 760 to 940 on all of the different levels of the test. For some reason, the SSAT changes their scale for each level of the test. So the elementary section goes from 300 to 600, the middle goes from 440 to 710, and the upper goes from 500 to 800 for each section. And then they add those 3 sections up, or yeah, the 3 sections up for the SSAT. If you tell somebody your scores a 710 on the SSAT upper level, nobody will really know what that means. So when you're talking about these scores, if you're preparing with us or if you're talking to admissions departments, you're usually going to be talking about the percentile that the student falls into. And so these tests are all graded on a curve, the same way that the SAT or ACT or GMAT, GRE, LSAT are. So it's really that you're competing against your peers who take the exact same version of the test on that day. And so the percentiles for this test tend to look a lot different than they do for most tests. And that's the first thing that I would warn parents about. When we get students who come in who are used to absolutely crushing it in school and they're very good at testing in general, it's a very frequent experience that they'll take a first practice test and score somewhere in the 40th percentile or 50th percentile. And that's something that students in that position are not used to seeing, and it can be very deflating and it can be shocking for parents. But what you want to consider is that this is not a test that is given to a general population. So I always equate it to the way that percentiles shift when you go from taking the SAT to the LSAT or the GMAT or the GRE, where the SAT and the ACT are challenging tests in their own right, but they're given to millions of people every year. There are lots of people who take both of them simply because they have to, even if they're not interested in college. So in those tests, you know, to be considered elite, you really have to be in the 90-something percentile and up. On the LSAT or the GMAT or the GRE, or in this case, on the ISEE and the SSAT, the percentiles are much more competitive because the only people who are taking the ISEE and SSAT are people who either are crushing it in public school and are being told by, you know, their teachers and advisors and parents that they should be exploring this process, and people who already go to private schools who are getting a great education and are well prepared for these tests. So similarly to when you're competing against other, you know, candidates for business school or law school, it's going to be a much more competitive pool, and schools understand that. So I would say that competitive, like very competitive schools generally have scores, average scores that range from the 50th percentile for good competitive schools to really like the 80th percentile for truly elite, extremely competitive schools. So like Exeter's median percentile is the 85th percentile. Andover is in the same range. So there is no reason to put pressure on, you know, yourself if you're a student preparing for these, or your child if you're a parent who has a student preparing for these, to score in the 90th percentile. It's pretty unheard of that students are able to score in those truly, you know, tremendous percentile ranges. And regardless of where you test at the beginning on these scales, your student can definitely improve and get into the range that they need to be for schools that are competitive. It's simply about effort and focus and diligence. I would say that the best thing you can do when you're exploring these is to get out in front of the process early and have your student take a practice test of the SSAT and of the ISEE, and sit down and go through their percentile scores and compare them to what the schools you're most interested in are telling you that they're looking for. I think Alex can correct me if I'm wrong, but in my experience, it seems like private high schools are very open with parents and students about what they're looking for in their candidates. And if you contact them directly, they're happy to talk you through what they're hoping to see from testing options. And you also want to keep in mind that you don't want to devote so much time and energy into testing that you're falling behind in school, or, you know, not taking the time to really make yourself known to the admissions office through the interview process and through the rest of the application. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the content on each, and then we can open it up to questions. So they're very similar. Like I said, I kind of equate it to the difference between the SAT and the ACT, where they're essentially designed to test the same types of skills and knowledge. So naturally, they have a lot in common. Both tests have vocab sections. If you think that seems outdated, I kind of agree. But for the ISEE, it's 40 questions where the first part is synonyms and the second half you fill in the blank on sentences. And for the SSAT, it's 60 vocab questions. First half is synonyms, second half is analogies. Some of the vocabulary words that you will see on these tests are legitimately very advanced. So no matter which level of the test you're taking, and no matter how well read your student is, there are going to be vocab words that they don't know. And I think getting used to the idea that there are questions that you're not going to be comfortable on is one of the biggest challenges on these tests. So students should just go in knowing there's going to be some unreasonable, unfair vocab questions, but everybody sees those same questions, and it's not about getting every question right. It's about doing well compared to other people. So be realistic with the vocab. For the ISEE, second section is always the quantitative reasoning. Both of these tests have two math sections. The SSAT naturally calls them both the same thing. They're both called the quantitative section. And they both have 25 questions, straight multiple choice format. The ISEE does it a little bit different. The quantitative reasoning, which is the first math section, has 37 questions. It's a combination of normal multiple choice and quantitative comparison questions. So if anybody has ever taken the GRE, they have these same types of questions where they have a quantity in column A and a quantity in column B. usually that you have to determine through some sort of algebra or geometry calculation. And you have to say whether A is bigger, B is bigger, they're the same, or you can't tell. Both tests have reading comprehension sections. I would say that they operate at a very similar level. The SSAT has 40 multiple choice questions. The ISEE has 36. And for the ISEE's second math section, they do not have quantitative comparisons. It's just 47 multiple choice questions. So there are a lot more math questions on the ISEE. And there's also 2 separate math scores, because you get a separate score for quantitative reasoning and a separate score for math achievement. However, I would say that most schools sort of weight math as heavily for the SSAT as they do for the ISEE. So I wouldn't say that if you're a strong math student, the ISEE is definitely going to be a better test. It's sort of just, it's hard to tell until you've seen them both. Both tests also have a writing sample. They are not scored, but like Alex mentioned, admissions offices can see them. So it's worth, you know, having students practice a little bit and just get used to the format of it. But realistically, timed writing samples aren't necessarily going to be the focus point of any admissions crew. So not really worth worrying too much about if your student's not a great writer. So that's essentially what the tests are. For both of them, the math goes beyond the grade level that the students are currently at. So it's going to push younger students into topics from geometry and higher level algebra than they've seen. And for the reading comprehension, some of the questions are legitimately hard. So again, similar to the vocab, you just have to go in knowing that it's not going to feel like a school test. If you're shooting for 100% of the questions the way that any student should be, you know, aiming for on a school test, it's going to be a very frustrating and eye-opening experience, I would say. So go in understanding that it's just about getting the questions right that you should get right. And if you do that, then you're going to end up with a great score. And one other difference in terms of test taking strategy that I should mention before we go to questions is just that in the ISEE, there is no penalty for guessing. Your raw score is simply calculated by how many questions you get right. They compare that to how many questions other people got right, and it spits out your scaled score and your percentile. For the SSAT, your raw score is calculated by giving you 1 point for every correct question, but then they take away 1/4 of a point for every wrong answer. So there is a little bit more sort of game strategy that goes into the SSAT in terms of when to answer. The simple explanation that I would give anybody is that if you can confidently rule out any answers, then you should guess. If you can't, then you have no idea what's going on in the question and there's no point. So yeah, that is essentially the testing piece. And I think, you know, the best advice in terms of the testing is, like I said, just get out in front of it. If you know that you're going to be going through it, find out where they are at currently. And if they're in the range that they need to be in, then don't do anything. And if they aren't, then, you know, set up a plan to practice and prepare, because these are learnable skills and concepts. Everybody is capable of learning more vocabulary, of memorizing more math equations, and essentially that's what it takes. So, all right, so let's go to questions, I guess.
Yeah, so for those of you who are new to Zoom webinar format, at the bottom of your screen, there should be a questions box. And so you can submit questions for Jamie or I or both of us, or I'm sure Olivia would be happy to hop back on at some point. But yes, if there are questions, go ahead and start populating those, and we'll turn the questions box.
Oh, okay. So when should I start preparing for the ISEE or SSAT? I would say it depends on where you're at when you take a first practice test. If you know that you're going to be applying this fall, then I would take a practice test now. And like I said before, if you're in your range already, then don't worry about it for a while. You know, come back to it a few weeks before the test to make sure that you're fresh on the material and the format. But you don't really have to crush yourself if you're already there. If you come back with a score that's, you know, way below where you need to be in the fall, then you should start studying over the summer. And if you come back with a score that's, you know, within striking distance of your target range, but not quite there yet, then I would say it's probably best to have fun over the summer, not worry about it, and then start preparing, you know, in August or beginning of the school year.
Jamie, I'm going to add on to that because I don't think we talked all about the timeline for school applications. And so if you all were to be looking at the upcoming year, applications typically will be due the previous January or February for really early schools. Some schools will accept applications through March, April, and then there are schools that have space in their programs that are open, and so they may be enrolling one-offs or throughout the summer too. So you can always, it's never too late to apply. I think you can always reach out to a school to even see if, you know, if you were ever interested in like a mid-year situation. I just always say, ask the question, even if the webpage says we're not accepting, or unless it says explicitly we're no longer accepting applications. If the deadline has passed, always just ask the question of if they're still willing to consider. There's another question in the chat about what are some questions to ask when looking at different high schools. So I think Jamie and I talked a little bit about the questions, you know, around like testing dates and application materials. But I would say some of the other things that you really want to consider for your student are if your student has any learning differences or needs learning needs, right? What sort of tutoring or support does the school offer? Depending on what grade level you're looking at, right? You can always start to ask about things like AP courses or courses that will get them credit for college, depending on what kind of school they're looking at and what they're considering for the future. For boarding schools, I think a great question is to ask about like, what is your weekend? What do weekends look like for this community of students? You know, there are some really interesting boarding schools that are in really small cities in the US, which I think has a whole different lifestyle than schools that are located in major cities or just outside of major cities. And so really think about what is it that you would want. And this is a really great way to kind of test the waters for what kind of college you may want to. An urban environment or a suburban or even rural experience can all be really cool to have. And then to go on to have something different in college. So I think just starting to think about what are you excited about? What are you interested in? And do they offer those things, right? If you're a family who loves to ski, is there a place to ski nearby the boarding school, or do they do ski bus, right? Some schools do different activities. So just really ask the questions that you want to know about and that will impact your quality of life, I would say for sure. Jamie, anything to add or?
No, I think that that's the exact advice I would give to clients and students too, is just, you know, think about what is really going to make you happy, because if you're choosing a boarding school, especially, it's like you're committing to that for years, and it's, you know, it's the same weight as choosing a college. Like you're going to still spend 4 years usually of your life there. So definitely worth thinking about, you know, what do you want to spend your time doing? What types of people do you want to surround yourself with? And what opportunities do they offer you?
Let's see, what else is coming in the chat?
Virtual testing options. So somebody asked if the ISEE and SSAT are offering virtual testing, and the answer is yes. Both of them have at-home testing options that they began using during the pandemic. And as far as it seems, they will continue using those going into the future. So you still have the option of taking the ISEE or SSAT at testing locations. Like I said, a lot of private schools or independent schools give them on their grounds. There's also testing agencies that give them at testing locations. But if you're comfortable working out of your home, then you can take it from home too.
And it doesn't show up differently for us as readers, right? Like it's the same output, basically. Like the scoring is all the same and stuff like that. There's another one in here about how post-grad years work, which I think is an interesting question. Post-grad, for those of you who may not have considered, there are some schools in the US, primarily boarding schools, that will allow students to, after they've completed their 4 years of high school, actually take a 5th year at the school. And these are really interesting because they can offer opportunities for a student to just grow a little bit more before they start the college application process in a school setting. Particularly for students who are international or who may be considering they just need extra time to get like extracurriculars together or English proficiency, right? It can be a really cool way to consider if you've done your 4 years in your home country to apply to do a post-grad year as an in-between between when you apply to college and when you go to college. So you'd be applying to college during that year. What's great about that is it really just gives families the opportunity and students that opportunity to really build up their resume and do it in an established school context, where a lot of those schools already are starting to build relationships with colleges and universities. So if you go to a public school in your home country that's maybe taught in a different language and you really need the year of language immersion in English, this is a really great way to consider just pushing back your year, and it can really help you elevate the quality of colleges that you can target. So definitely really strongly consider a post-grad year. Lots of schools do not advertise that they do a post-grad year. So you might come across it on some schools' websites. Some schools will not mention it. But I would always reach out and just ask the question of, would you be willing to consider a post-grad year if that's something you eventually are interested in? Another question about the most important part of the application. Jamie and I probably have similar and different answers for this at the same time, just from different perspectives. Jamie, maybe do you want to jump in and just give?
Sure. So I would say that from the testing side, that's like a bar you have to clear for certain schools, but I wouldn't call it necessarily the most important part of the application, because I think that for those schools that really are score driven, that will get them to look at your application and it will get them to consider you. But I would say that like the direct contact with the school, the essays and the interview, I think are weighted more heavily.
I think that's totally accurate, Jamie. The testing piece, I think you're right. Some schools will say you have to have a minimum score, and they may not be totally transparent about that in the process. Usually they'll give you an estimate, but there's oftentimes like they want this score, right? And that's their working point. So I think you're right. It'll get you in the door for the conversation. I personally, from my side, I think that the student interview has a lot of weight. It's an opportunity, and really our only opportunity to really get an authentic feel for the kid and the family. And, you know, do you know the school really well? Are you really sure that that's the school you want to go to? And it for students for English, for whom English is a second language, it's also, like I said earlier, an English evaluation tool for them to just get a sense of, are you going to be able to keep up with the workload in a primarily English speaking environment? So I think it has multiple results, but I think holds a lot of importance in the process.
What's the benefit of going to an independent boarding school instead of just staying at my home school? Well, I'll let you mostly answer this, but I would say it probably depends what school you're at currently. And what I always tell people who are exploring this process is that you can get to elite colleges from any high school at this point. And you want to think, first about what the student wants and whether the student is currently happy or would be happier elsewhere. But Alex, I'll let you speak more to other benefits or true benefits.
I mean, I could probably go on about this forever as an admissions person at an independent school. I think there are lots of benefits. Typically, some of the highlight points are going to be a small student to faculty ratio, so a small classroom. So average public school in the US has 30 to 40 students in a classroom. The average independent school classroom has about 15. And so that's a pretty big difference when you think about the number of kids a teacher sees a day and their opportunities just to really get to know a kid and make sure that they're supported. And so for students who feel maybe like they're not thriving in their current school, or they are just like, lost in the middle of the class, an independent school can really be a great way to find a spot to hone in on what that student needs to find school engaging and really challenge them and support them. For students who are already thriving, really at the top of their class academically in their school setting, an independent school may offer them an additional level of challenge, an ability to customize a program or have them do an independent study, or really just push them to that next level because of the smaller classes and attention. And for students who are maybe falling behind the rest of their class, again, that special attention and individualized attention that a school can offer can really support them in either catching back up. So you'll see some families who really like the independent middle school, 6 through 8 option. And there are independent boarding schools for middle school too, that are just middle school. And so that gives families an opportunity really to just catch their student up, feel really confident, and then maybe reintegrate them back into their homeschool environment or back home. For international students, I'll also add that I think going to an established US school, if you particularly are maybe in a public school that doesn't send a lot of students to the US in your home country, or you don't see that happen quite frequently, an opportunity to study abroad at the high school level can really help you with starting to familiarize yourself with colleges, do that English immersion, and get some of the reputation of the US school, right, where they already have some relationship with the university. And so it can give you a little bit more support in that application process, I would say, just because of the school is already a known factor. So I think, Jamie, you're right, though, in saying like it really depends on what your home environment is and what your school right now is. And, if a student doesn't feel like that's the right fit, really pushing them to do this independent school transition can sometimes backfire too. So just make sure that your kid is on board all the way and is like really invested in this process too. And even if they're nervous, they can get excited about it through the process, but they have to have that level of buy-in too. A good question. Right. Amy, are we missing any? Are there any others that?
I don't see any that, yeah, I think we've answered them all. So.
Right. Well, I think then with that in mind, we'll do one last call for any questions, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great, and we are always happy to answer additional questions. And if you have any further feedback for us, just let us know. We're always excited to try to help families and connect with you all wherever you are. So thanks for coming this evening.
Thanks, everyone.